Hello, class. I wanted to go over chapter 2 of our textbook, the A Biocultural Approach to Sex, Love, and Intimacy in Central Africa. I know we've already covered that, but we had to do so much sort of learning about some of these basic anthropological principles. We've been learning about kinship and things and modes of production that we're just getting around to talking about this chapter. But I did want to go over it briefly to show you the way that it's fitting into the rest of the class and what the purpose of having this is. So I have this sort of model right here that is going into a little bit of detail about the biocultural model, and that is the interaction between environment, biology, and culture, which is how we end up with these certain kinds of male-female socio-sexual relationships. So we've been talking about the ways that economics has a really big impact on a group's gender relationships, whether or not men are going to be outright the most dominant patriarchal gender, and how it determines a whole bunch of different aspects of the culture. Yeah, and we talked about farming and things of that nature. But when I was first doing my research on South Korea, a lot of the research that I read was primarily about I'm going to skip this slide, go to the next one. You can read this on your own. My research was, when I was doing my research, a lot of what we know about sociosexual relationships within marital unions is based almost entirely upon highly stratified cultures and nations. So a lot of people were doing work in the United States, in Western Europe, and a few people like me were doing work in Japan, South Korea, and looking at gender equity and the ways that people interact between the sexes, and particularly intimate relationships. But people didn't really look at foragers and farmers and people outside of those particularly highly developed cultures. And that's what this chapter does. This chapter is really highlighting a lot of the stuff that I talked to you about when we were talking about gender equity and various economic developments, right? So we have this really nice case study of the Aka and the Ngandu. The Aka are foragers, and they're this bottom right picture right here. They're very well studied by anthropologists. You can see them foraging some meat that they caught. And then the Ngandu are up here, and they are farmers. So again, Aka are foragers. They have villages, but their villages move very frequently, very typical of foragers. They have high gender, political, and intergenerational equality. So that means that people who are of different genders, of different generations, all have about equal access to resources, to power, prestige, things of that nature within the group. Now, that doesn't mean it's absolutely equal or absolute equality, but it's relatively equal. And then we go to the Ngandu, and this is a group of people that live right next to the Aka. They have been living adjacent to each other, interacting with each other culturally for thousands of years. And like I've said before, it's not like foragers suddenly discovered farming and said, oh, that's a great way to live. I'm going to stop doing this foraging. I'm going to, it's not this kind of thing. It's not globalizing, and it's not people taking it on because they like it. But there is this group of farmers, Ngandu, who practice slash and burn agricultural. So they're a little bit in between, agriculturalist perhaps and horticulturalist, low-level technology farming. They usually live in the same house their entire lives and work in the same area. So almost all of their life is spent in a very small geographic area, unlike the Aka, who are moving around quite a bit. And even though they have a very similar culture, it's a very similar language, a lot of similar territory, all of these things that we think are would make them extremely similar to the Aka, but except for their economic system being different, makes their political system highly unequal, makes their gender stratification highly unequal, and their intergenerational equality also highly inequitable. So all of these things just change it. The introduction of a sedentary way of life that creates incentive for people to accumulate resources, whereas if you're an Aka forager, you can't accumulate resources because you're moving all the time, and that creates generational wealth, which creates political hierarchy, which creates gender stratification. Although gender stratification is also just created by the use of farming. Men tend to be in control of the farms. That's the men are in control of the primary mode of production, so they tend to be dominant. As you see all over the world, this happens over and over. Farming cultures tend to be very, very patriarchal, as are the Ngandu. So, drawing from the book and lecture, what are some of the reasons for these differences in equality but for the Aka and the Gandu? I've already discussed that a little bit, but can you think of any other reasons? Come on, there we go. Okay, so the book talks a little bit about foundational schema. That's ideas, knowledge, and values that provide a foundation for cultural models in a variety of domains of cultural life, right? So the Aka are actually one of the most egalitarian cultures in the ethnographic record around the world, looking at all the different, even among all the different foraging groups that we have in the anthropological ethnographic record, the Aka are very gender egalitarian, and egalitarian in general. They have extensive gender role flexibility, with men and women regularly switching subsistence and childcare roles. It's not a problem. They don't necessarily have man's work and women's work in the way that we do in the United States, although that is changing. Now, the Ngandu have a different foundational schema that emphasizes deference and respect by women and children to elders, to men, to the ancestors. And you've read about this in the book. So, drawing from the Aka example, and we've also talked about this in terms of foundational schema, of like origination myths, things of that nature. What are some American foundational schema? What would we, if you had to write up our foundational schema, how might you do that? So I really thought this was also interesting from this chapter. They don't really necessarily, the Aka, don't have this idea of work and play dichotomy. Like I've mentioned before, a lot of foragers don't really have a work-play dichotomy, whereas you and I, when we go home, well, maybe not you and maybe not I, because we're professors and students, but most people go to work and they're at work and then they come home and they're not at work anymore. They are resting or at play, right? But what about sex? Do we think about sex as being part of work or part of play? You've listened to the podcast from Hidden Brain that talked a little bit about this, but do we have sex for play or pleasure, do you think? And does that change throughout our life cycles, right? When you're young, I think that might be a very different answer than perhaps when you're older. I'm not sure. But how do the Aka and the Ngandu think about sex? Do they both think about sex as either work, or do they both think about sex as either play? How is that different? And what are some of the effects of this kind of thinking for the Aka, the Ngandu, and for us Americans, the way that we tend to think about it, right? Our basic, as we've learned during the urinal game and talking about the way that culture works, our basic physiological makeup may control sex drive. We all have essentially the same biology. But that doesn't mean we satisfy those biological urges in the same way. Our emotional and cultural models certainly influence the expression of sexual desire and sexual activity, which may also be affected by particular ecological conditions like we're talking about, such as high infant mortality rates, diversity of infectious diseases, parasites, all these ecologicals that interact with culture and interact with our individual biology, which helps to account for the fact that some aspects of sex are incredibly biologically driven, but a lot of them are shaped, our biological drives are shaped and created by culture, and again, ecology. Come on. There we go. So love and intimacy. Attachment probably involved in parent-infant relationships. Like the evolution, as we listen to Helen Fisher describe it, evolution of the emotion of love. Do spiders feel love? Well, probably not. They probably don't have a biological emotion, a certain chemical that goes off in their brains, which they don't have. They don't have brains, so that makes them feel love. We developed love in the same sense that we evolved and developed fear. Creatures that have a fear emotion live longer than creatures that do not. It was evolutionarily advantageous for human beings to be afraid of snakes, because then you ran away from snakes. They were dangerous. It's also evolutionarily advantageous for us to feel love. It helps us to raise our infants, because our infants are particularly useless when they're born. It takes a very long time, a lot of input to get a infant human being from infancy to adulthood. And that's not true for a lot of other species of animal. We are particularly helpless, and so we've evolved this kind of love feeling to keep infants alive. So infants attached to a particular others were more likely to survive, increasing the reproductive success of both child, mother, and biological kin. So everybody, it takes a village. The whole village looks out for infants. But what about husband-wife relationships? The husband-wife relationships, the love that is felt, again, between these two groups that live very, very close to each other, the Aka have these close, intimate, and giving relationships that are very similar to romantic relationships in the U.S. in some ways. Well, depends on the particular romantic relationship, no judgment, but some people have very close, intimate and giving relationships, and that's what the Aka seem to have. Relationships of equity, the romantic love that we tend to idealize, that people come into the relationship as equals and function as equals, and everything is given and shared. Now, the Ngandu is very different. Their concept of love, the way their husband-wife relationships work out, are different. They're much more perfunctory and distant. They don't really share that many activities. They're sort of a lot more like two cogs working together to, in harmony sometimes, but not always in harmony, to accomplish goals. It's a lot less of the romantic love that we've been talking about, and a little bit more like a companionate relationship. But of course, this is a little bit fraught because, as you know, there's some violence in these relationships. How can we explain these differences using the biocultural approach? How would you explain husband-wife relationships in the United States? Are we more like the Aka, or are we more like the Ngandu? I'm not really sure, so I'd like to hear what you have to say. Which brings us up to this last section to talk about the Aka and the Ngandu. The Aka, they found, these ethnographers who were studying them found that domestic aggression was pretty rare. And when it did happen, it was typically the wife being physically aggressive to the man. It didn't happen very often, but sometimes in extreme cases, the wife might slap her husband if something very, very bad was happening. Whereas the Ngandu, domestic violence was actually quite frequent, as was marital rape, what they called brutal sex, and this was perfectly allowed in their culture, not necessarily encouraged, but it did happen, and there weren't really any recourses. And the type of violence was typically men against women, a really, really different reversal. So Aka men and women, but also Ngandu women, violence caused by thinking a spouse was sleeping with or developing a relationship with somebody else. That was the primary reason for these Aka men and women, but also Ngandu women, to slap in the case of the Aka women. But in other cases, other types of domestic violence, this was the cause. How are Aka and Ngandu patterns of violence and anger illustrative of the influence of biology and culture? Is this a... sorry, my camera went down. I had to read the bottom of the screen. What did they say? What do you remember from the reading? I want you to find this. Talk about this mate retention strategy. And do you buy this argument?